Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Eminences, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It's an honor to be here today and to have been given the opportunity to speak to you about one of the ways in which Sweden has tried to protect children's rights and also the rights of women and men who are victims of trafficking. It's already been said here that criminalization is not enough. It's not the solution, but it's one important thing that we can do in order to prevent. On January 1st, 1999, the Swedish legislation prohibiting the purchase of sex came into force. This legislation criminalizes obtaining a casual sexual relation in exchange for payment in money or otherwise. If convicted, the punishment for the buyer in the Swedish law normally is a fine, but the law also says that there can be a sentence of imprisonment. The maximum penalty when the law came into force was 6 months, but now it's 1 year. And if the victim is under 18, the maximum penalty now is 2 years. Attempts to buy sex are also punishable, and the victim, as well as the perpetrator, can be a man or a woman. The law criminalizes the purchase of sex. First and foremost, of course, it applies to offenses committed in Sweden. But also, if a Swedish citizen purchases sex abroad, and if the victim is under 18, this is also, according to the Swedish law, a crime. And the law, as it is today, also applies if Swedish military personnel, for example, buys sex abroad, and this has been, for example, implemented against men exploiting women in prostitution in Kosovo. In 2008, when this ban had been in force for 10 years, the government appointed me to lead a special inquiry, and our task was to evaluate the implementation of the law and its effects. Our results that we came up with were based on statistical material and research reports that had investigated different aspects of trafficking and prostitution during the 10 years of the law. We also consulted with police, social workers, civil society, public authorities, and other key stakeholders, and we contacted women in prostitution and women who had been able to leave prostitution in order to get their opinions. The committee report was presented to the government in the summer of 2010. What were our conclusions? We found that the number of persons exploited in street prostitution in Sweden had halved in 10 years since 1999. Before the law, the situation when it came to the amount of prostitution had been about the same in the Nordic countries, and we made a comparison with Norway and Denmark, since those are the countries that are most like Sweden. And when we looked in 2008, we could see that the neighboring countries, Denmark and Norway, had 3 times as many individuals in street prostitution as we had in Sweden. This was before the Norwegian legislation was adopted, and after Norway adopted its law prohibiting the buying of sex in 2009, they have found that they have had a radical decrease also in the amount of street prostitution. Prostitution contacts through the internet had, of course, increased in Sweden during those 10 years, as it had in other countries. But this, of course, could not be considered to be a result of the law, but a natural development considering the growth of online technology. And when we looked at it, we found that the number of individuals offering sex via internet, web pages, and ads, according to the surveys that had been made, was much larger, also there in comparison with Denmark and Norway. According to police and social workers, there was no evidence that there was an increase of indoor prostitution or that prostitution had gone underground. This was one of the things that has been said and is still said about this, but there is no evidence that this is the case. And one reason, or you could say, is that prostitution is business. Business has to be visible in order to find the buyers. And policemen, if you ask them, they say, we are maybe not the smartest, but we are not that stupid. We can find them if the buyer can find them. So despite a significant increase in prostitution in the neighboring countries during those 10 years, there was no evidence of a similar increase in Sweden. And we found it reasonable to believe that this was due to the new legislation. We also found that the criminalization had deterred the establishment of organized crime and networks and groups in Sweden. And the national police in Sweden, as the Swedish National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Human Beings, has concluded in several reports that the law functions as a barrier against the establishment of traffickers and pimps in Sweden. A very important thing also is that the law has strong support among the public. It has led to a significant change in attitude. Hence, we find it has had a normative effect, which I would say almost is the most important effect, as well as the direct effect to reduce the extent of prostitution and trafficking. The criminalization acts also as a deterrent for the buyers. Persons with experience in prostitution, as well as police and social workers, conclude that the buyers in Sweden have become much more careful, and the demand has actually decreased since the prohibition came into force. This is, of course, difficult to measure, but according to a study in 2008, less than 8% of Swedish men had in the last year bought someone for prostitution purposes, and this could be compared to 10 years before that, before the law was put into force, when this number was more than 13%. Despite misgivings that the criminalization of buyers would make it more difficult to reach women in prostitution, that prostitution would go underground, and that the conditions of individuals engaged in prostitution would worsen, we have found that there is no evidence of that the prohibition has led to more violence or worse conditions. But of course, it is very dangerous. It's lethal to be in this business, which is why also it should be abolished. Police and prosecutors in Sweden do not see any administrative difficulties to enforce the law, but of course, good enforcement depends on the resources available and what priorities are made by the justice system. How do we go forward now? It is very important to stress that although two distinct phenomena, there is a clear and very strong link between prostitution and trafficking. And according to the UN Global Report on Trafficking in People 2014, which has been mentioned before today, 33 of the detected victims are children. Twice as many are girls as boys. And in Europe, the vast majority, it's something in between 60–80% of the victims of trafficking are victims of sexual exploitation. The number of victims is almost incomprehensible, and there have been some figures already today, and I have the figure that it's estimated that only in Europe, every day, it could be said that 140,000 women and girls every day are victims of trafficking for sexual purposes. They are forced into prostitution. And this, as has also been said before, finances other types of organized crime. Thus, combating trafficking is also work to combat criminality on a larger scale. Therefore, to stop trafficking, it is essential to also stop prostitution. And the new, as it's called, approach of the Swedish or the Nordic model is to focus on demand, as the minister has said already. We focus on the buyer. And this actually is a really simple and logical thing. If there is no demand, there would be no prostitution. This is a human rights perspective, as the ministers also pointed out. It's not a moral perspective, it's a human rights perspective, and it's also a very strong gender equality issue, since the majority, as I've already said, are women and girls of the victims. Several reports have shown, I wanted to say that today, that the opposite way of dealing with this, if we want trafficking to go away, if we want prostitution to go away, the other way of dealing with the problem, to legalize the business and consider selling sex something as an ordinary job, has not been successful. I do not have the time to go into detail, and there are lots of reports. It's already been mentioned, the UN Global Report on Trafficking in 2014, but I will also mention to you a very strong voice in favor of the Nordic model, and that was a report last year by the European Commission's rapporteur, Mr. Mendes Bota. In his report, which is named Prostitution, Trafficking, and Modern Slavery in Europe, he concludes that, according to his opinion, voluntary prostitution is a myth. For the large majority, prostitution is the consequence of either a state of poverty and extreme need or of violence. And he also emphasizes that every country has the right to choose its own way, of course, but he strongly advised legislatures all over Europe to follow the example of Sweden and other Nordic countries and criminalize the purchase of sexual services. And as you all know, also the European Parliament has been voting on this issue. Like Mr. Bota, I believe it is today the most effective measure to combat trafficking of human beings, to have this criminalization and try to work on having no demand. We have to continue this work, especially for the sake of our children, the children of our world. I will finish by saying that more than 150 years ago, in 1862, the great writer Victor Hugo wrote Les Misérables, as you all know. And there he says, "Some say that slavery has disappeared from European civilization. That is incorrect. It still exists, but now it weighs only on women, and it's called prostitution." We have to be persistent. This is the challenge we meet still today. Thank you for your attention.